1345 arrived with Sultan Orhan Gazi, now 57 years old and ruling an Ottoman state that had grown from a modest frontier principality into the dominant power in northwestern Anatolia, turning his strategic attention toward the Karesi Beylik, a Turkish principality controlling the southern shores of the Sea of Marmara and the northern Aegean coast, whose annexation would provide the Ottomans with something they desperately lacked: direct access to major naval ports, experienced maritime commanders, and established shipbuilding infrastructure that could transform the landlocked Ottoman state into a genuine naval power. The Karesi territory, stretching along the coast from the Dardanelles to the Gulf of Adramit, and including the strategically vital ports of Pegai and Adramyttium, represented a prize of extraordinary value. Not for its size, the Beylik controlled perhaps 5,000 square miles. Modest compared to Ottoman possessions, but for its geographic position, commanding access to the Aegean Sea, and its population's expertise in maritime affairs that Anatolian Turkish principalities typically lacked. Orhan recognized, with the strategic acumen that had characterized his entire reign, that controlling Karesi would enable Ottoman expansion across the Dardanelles into Europe, provide naval capabilities to challenge Byzantine and Italian maritime dominance, and position the Ottomans as a true regional power rather than merely a successful Anatolian Beylik. The Karesi Beylik's unique character among 14th-century Anatolian Turkish principalities derived from its geographic position on the Aegean coast, which had forced its rulers to develop naval capabilities and maritime commercial expertise unusual among Turkish states that generally focused on land warfare and agriculture. Founded in the late 13th century by Turkish warriors who had conquered Byzantine coastal territories during the Mongol-induced chaos that fragmented Anatolia, Karesi had evolved into a maritime power whose fleets raided Byzantine islands, whose merchants traded throughout the Aegean, and whose shipyards produced vessels that could challenge Greek and Italian naval forces. The Beylik's rulers had recruited Greek sailors and shipwrights into their service, pragmatically recognizing that maritime expertise required technical knowledge that nomadic Turkish traditions did not provide, creating a hybrid Turkish-Greek maritime culture that would prove invaluable to the Ottomans once they acquired control. The population, though dominated by Turkish Muslim warrior elites, included substantial Greek Christian communities whose maritime skills and commercial networks made them economically essential despite their religious difference from their rulers. The political situation within the Karesi Beylik in 1345 created precisely the kind of internal divisions and succession disputes that skilled opportunists like Orhan could exploit, without necessarily resorting to prolonged military campaigns. The Beylik's founder had died years earlier, and his successors had proven far less capable, creating factional struggles among competing claimants and their aristocratic supporters that weakened central authority and made the principality vulnerable to external pressure. Different Karesi aristocratic families pursue their own interests, some advocating alliance with the powerful Ottomans as protection against other threats, others insisting on maintaining independence even if that meant military confrontation with Orhan's forces, and still others calculating that they might personally benefit from Ottoman annexation if they positioned themselves correctly during the transition. This internal fragmentation meant that Karesi presented Orhan with opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering, bribery, alliance building, and exploiting divisions alongside or instead of pure military conquest. Precisely the kind of complex political situation where the Sultan's sophisticated strategic approach could achieve objectives more efficiently than raw military force alone. The Byzantine strategic position regarding Karesi revealed the empire's continuing decline and inability to prevent Turkish expansion even in territories adjacent to Constantinople itself. The Byzantines had lost Karesi's coastal regions to Turkish conquest decades earlier, during the empire's period of catastrophic weakness following the Fourth Crusade's devastation and the subsequent Nicaean exile period. Occasional Byzantine naval raids against Karesi ports had achieved nothing beyond temporary harassment, as the empire lacked resources for sustained campaigns to recover lost territories. Emperor John V Kantakouzenos, who would soon become entangled in a civil war that would further weaken Byzantine power, could only watch helplessly as Ottoman influence expanded to yet another Anatolian region. The Byzantine diplomatic efforts to organize Christian coalitions against Turkish expansion, including appeals to European powers and attempts to coordinate with Italian maritime republics, generated rhetorical support but minimal concrete assistance. This pattern of Byzantine impotence in the face of Turkish expansion, now tragically familiar after decades of losses, meant that Orhan could pursue Karesi annexation without serious concern about Byzantine military intervention. The other Turkish beyliks in western Anatolia observed Orhan's interest in Karesi with a mixture of concern about Ottoman expansion and recognition that resistance to Ottoman power had become increasingly futile. The Aydin Beylik to the south, which controlled the important port of Smyrna and conducted its own naval operations in the Aegean, recognized that Ottoman acquisition of Karesi would position Orhan's forces on their northern border and potentially threaten their independence. The Saruhan and Menteşen's Beyliks, though further from immediate Ottoman pressure, understood that each Ottoman annexation strengthened Orhan's position relative to other Turkish principalities and brought the day closer when they might face similar pressure to submit or resist. Yet the demonstration of Ottoman military superiority over Byzantine forces at Pelikanen, the successful sieges of Bursa, Nicaea, and Nicomedia, and the sophisticated administrative capabilities the Ottomans had developed made resistance to Ottoman expansion seem increasingly hopeless for smaller beyliks that lacked comparable resources or organizational sophistication. This psychological advantage, the growing recognition throughout Anatolian Turkish principalities that Ottoman power was overwhelming and that accommodation might serve rulers' interests better than feudal resistance, would prove as valuable to Orhan as his military forces in achieving Karesi's annexation. Orhan's strategic approach to the Karesi situation in 1345 reflected his mature understanding that military conquest represented just one tool among many for expanding Ottoman territory, and that diplomatic, economic, and political pressure often achieved objectives more efficiently than warfare. He initiated contacts with various Karesi aristocratic factions, exploring which groups might be receptive to Ottoman alliance or outright annexation in exchange for promises of maintaining their positions and properties under Ottoman administration. He offered extremely generous terms to any Karesi nobles, willing to acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty, retention of estates, positions in Ottoman provincial government, marriage alliances connecting their families to the Ottoman dynasty, and guarantees of religious freedom for the Greek Christian populations under their authority. Simultaneously, he positioned Ottoman military forces along Karesi's borders and threatening deployments that made clear the consequences of refusing Ottoman terms, creating psychological pressure that made accommodation seem prudent while military resistance appeared suicidal. According to historical analysis by scholars such as He Flowery, whose detailed studies of early Ottoman expansion document the sophisticated combination of military threat and diplomatic inducement that characterized Orhan's methods, the Karesi campaign exemplified Ottoman strategic flexibility in employing whatever means, peaceful or military, would achieve territorial acquisition most efficiently. The spring of 1345 witnessed Orhan's diplomatic offensive against Karesi intensifying as Ottoman agents moved among the Beylik's aristocratic factions, distributing bribes, making promises, exploiting grievances, and systematically undermining whatever fragile unity existed among Karesi's leadership. The Sultan's approach combined careful intelligence gathering about internal Karesi politics with a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit factional divisions, personal ambitions, and practical calculations of self-interest that motivated medieval aristocrats, at least as much as abstract loyalties to their principality or religion. Ottoman envoys identified which Karesi nobles were deeply in debt and might welcome Ottoman financial assistance in exchange for political support, which families had been excluded from power by current rulers and might see Ottoman annexation as opportunity to advance their positions, in which Greek Christian communities chafed under Turkish Muslim rule and might prefer the more tolerant Ottoman administration that had proven its value in Bursa and Nicaea. This intelligence-driven diplomatic campaign, though less dramatic than military operations, proved extraordinarily effective at fracturing Karesi's internal cohesion and creating conditions where peaceful annexation or easy military conquest became possible. The response within Karesi to Ottoman diplomatic pressure revealed deep divisions between those advocating resistance to maintain independence and pragmatists arguing that accommodation with the powerful Ottomans offered better prospects than feudal military confrontation. The Beylik's nominal ruler, whose name the chronicles preserve imperfectly, but who appears to have been a grandson of the founder, attempted to rally support for maintaining Karesi independence and sought alliances with other Anatolian beyliks that might provide military assistance against Ottoman pressure. Yet his efforts encountered skepticism from aristocrats who had observed the fate of previous Ottoman enemies and questioned whether Karesi possessed the military capability to resist successfully, or whether allies would actually provide meaningful assistance rather than merely offering empty rhetorical support. Several prominent Karesi families, calculating that their personal interests might be better served under Ottoman rule than through continued service to a weak and declining principality, opened secret communications with Ottoman representatives exploring what positions and privileges they might expect if they facilitated Ottoman takeover. This internal fragmentation, carefully cultivated by Ottoman diplomacy, meant that even before any military operations commenced, Karesi's capacity for unified resistance had been severely compromised. The economic inducements Orhan offered to Karesi's maritime communities, sailors, shipwrights, and merchants engaged in Aegean trade proved particularly effective at building support for Ottoman annexation among populations whose specialized skills made them valuable, regardless of political sovereignty. The Sultan promised that Karesi ports would continue functioning with minimal disruption under Ottoman administration, that commercial privileges and tax rates would be maintained or even improved, that Greek Christian sailors and craftsmen would be welcome in Ottoman service with guaranteed religious freedom, and most enticingly, that Ottoman expansion into Europe would create enormous new opportunities for maritime commerce and naval operations that would enrich those who participated. These promises appealed powerfully to commercial and professional classes whose livelihoods depended more on stable governance and economic opportunity than on abstract questions of political sovereignty. Karesi merchants, comparing the thriving commerce in Ottoman-controlled Bursa and Nicaea with the uncertainty and factional conflict plaguing their own principality, increasingly viewed Ottoman annexation as potentially beneficial rather than catastrophic. Greek Christian maritime communities, having witnessed Ottoman religious tolerance in other conquered territories, recognized that their specialized skills would make them valuable to any ruler, and that Ottoman governance might actually provide better protection for Christian minorities than Turkish Muslim principalities typically offered. The military preparations Orhan conducted during spring 1345, though presented as purely defensive precautions, created the threatening backdrop that made Ottoman diplomatic offers impossible to ignore and resistance appear increasingly desperate. Ottoman forces concentrated along Karesi's borders in numbers that clearly exceeded what defensive requirements would justify, with the Sultan personally touring these deployments to demonstrate his commitment and to send an unmistakable message that military force stood ready to support diplomatic pressure if necessary. Ottoman cavalry conducted exercises and maneuvers visible from Karesi territories, displaying martial competence and numerical strength designed to intimidate potential resistors while impressing those already inclined toward accommodation. Simultaneously, Ottoman agents circulated reports, some accurate, others exaggerated, about the overwhelming forces assembled for Karesi operations, the inevitable defeat awaiting anyone who resisted, and the generous treatment that would be offered to those who submitted peacefully. This campaign of military intimidation, though not yet involving actual combat, proved extraordinarily effective at shifting calculations within Karesi toward acceptance of Ottoman terms rather than gambling on military resistance. The Byzantine diplomatic response to the unfolding Karesi crisis demonstrated the empire's continuing impotence and inability to prevent Ottoman expansion even in territories adjacent to Byzantine-controlled waters. Emperor John V, observing Ottoman designs on Karesi with alarm, given the Beylik's proximity to Constantinople and the Dardanelles, attempted to organize some kind of intervention that might preserve Karesi's independence as a buffer against further Ottoman expansion. Byzantine diplomats approached the Karesi leadership, offering alliance and promising naval support that might counterbalance Ottoman land forces. Yet these Byzantine promises rang hollow given the empire's track record of abandoning allies and failing to provide meaningful military assistance during previous Ottoman expansions. Karesi nobles who might otherwise have been receptive to Byzantine alliance remembered how Bursa, Nicaea, and Nicomedia had all fallen despite Byzantine promises of relief, and recognized that accepting Byzantine alliance might provoke Ottoman military action without providing any reliable protection against it. The empire's diplomatic impotence, itself a consequence of decades of military defeats and territorial losses, ensured that Byzantine efforts to prevent Karesi's annexation would prove as ineffective as previous attempts to halt Ottoman expansion. The gradual collapse of Karesi's resistance to Ottoman pressure during the summer 1345 occurred through a combination of diplomatic success and limited military operations that demonstrated Ottoman power without requiring full-scale invasion. Several prominent Karesi aristocratic families, concluding that opposition to the Ottomans was hopeless and that their personal interests would be better served through accommodation, publicly declared their allegiance to Sultan Orhan and opened their territories to Ottoman administration. These defections, carefully orchestrated through months of diplomatic preparation, triggered cascading effects as other Karesi nobles recognized that unified resistance was impossible once significant factions had already submitted, and that continuing opposition would only isolate them further. Ottoman military forces occupied territories whose lords had submitted without encountering resistance. gradually expanding Ottoman administrative control while avoiding the casualties and destruction that contested conquest would have caused. The Karesi ruler, watching his support dissolving and his principality fragmenting, faced an increasingly desperate situation where his options had narrowed to either accepting some negotiated settlement that might preserve limited autonomy or facing inevitable military defeat that would strip him of all authority and possessions. Autumn 1345 witnessed the culmination of Orhan's diplomatic campaign as the Karesi ruler, recognizing that continued resistance was futile and that the best terms available would only deteriorate if he delayed further, entered into formal negotiations with Ottoman representatives to arrange the Beylik's peaceful transfer to Ottoman control. The negotiations revealed both the Karesi leader's desperate situation and Orhan's calculated generosity in offering terms designed to make surrender palatable while establishing precedents that would facilitate future Ottoman annexations of other Anatolian beyliks. The Karesi ruler would be permitted to retain certain estates as personal property, would receive a generous pension from the Ottoman treasury, and would be offered an honorific position at the Ottoman court that provided status without actual power, essentially a comfortable retirement in exchange for surrendering sovereignty. His family members would be integrated into the Ottoman aristocracy through marriage alliances and administrative appointments, ensuring their continued prosperity while binding them to the Ottoman system. Most significantly for the Karesi population, Orhan promised that administrative disruption would be minimized, that local officials who swore loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan would retain their positions, and that the region's maritime commerce and naval traditions would be actively encouraged and expanded under Ottoman governance. The formal ceremony marking Karesi's peaceful annexation, conducted in late 1345 with elaborate ritual designed to honor both sides while unmistakably establishing Ottoman supremacy, represented a triumph of Orhan's diplomatic approach that achieved territorial expansion without the casualties and destruction that military conquest would have entailed. The Karesi ruler and his principal nobles traveled to the Ottoman court, where they publicly acknowledged Orhan's suzerainty in ceremonies attended by representatives from across the Ottoman domains and foreign ambassadors whose presence ensured that news of Ottoman expansion would spread throughout the region. Orhan received their submission with calculated magnanimity, publicly embracing the Karesi leader as a valued ally rather than a defeated enemy, distributing generous gifts to demonstrate Ottoman wealth, and making speeches emphasizing that the Karesi people were joining a dynamic, expanding state that would provide opportunities and prosperity impossibly for a small, independent principality. The ceremony's choreography balanced Ottoman triumph with respect for Karesi's dignity, sending carefully calibrated messages. Resistance to the Ottomans was futile, but submission would be rewarded rather than punished. Ottoman power was overwhelming, but Ottoman governance was just and beneficial. These messages, transmitted through the formal annexation ceremony and spread through chronicles and diplomatic reports, would influence calculations of other Anatolian beyliks facing similar Ottoman pressure in subsequent years. Yet not all Karesi nobles accepted the peaceful annexation, as several families and military commanders who valued independence above personal gain or who distrusted Ottoman promises chose resistance despite the overwhelming odds against them. These holdouts, concentrated primarily in coastal fortresses and territories distant from areas where Ottoman forces had already established control, represented perhaps a third of the Karesi Beylik's original extent and required military operations that Orhan had hoped to avoid through purely diplomatic means. The resistors' motivations combined ideological commitment to Turkish Muslim independence from what they viewed as an increasingly powerful and potentially threatening Ottoman state, personal rivalries with Karesi aristocrats who had accepted Ottoman terms, and practical calculations that their strategic positions in fortified coastal locations might enable successful resistance where others had failed. According to historical sources analyzed by scholars such as Colin Imber, whose comprehensive studies of Ottoman expansion document both peaceful and military annexation methods, these Karesi resistance pockets represented the inevitable limit of diplomatic approaches and required the military operations that would characterize the 1346 phase of the campaign. The Ottoman military response to Karesi resistance in early 1346 demonstrated the evolved capabilities of Orhan's forces after 2 decades of nearly constant warfare and the development of sophisticated siege and naval tactics. The Sultan deployed substantial forces, perhaps 8,000 warriors, including elite cavalry, professional infantry, and importantly, the naval units that had been developed during previous campaigns against Byzantine coastal cities. Ottoman commanders applied lessons learned from the sieges of Bursa, Nicaea, Nicomedia, patient blockade to cut supply lines, systematic application of military pressure without costly assaults, diplomatic offers to individual garrison commanders promising generous treatment for surrender, and willingness to invest time in reducing fortresses through economic strangulation rather than attempting quick victories through direct assault that might incur unacceptable casualties. The military operations proceeded methodically rather than dramatically, as Ottoman forces surrounded resistant strongholds, cut them off from external support, and waited for the inevitable surrender that would come when defenders recognized the hopelessness of their position and the attractiveness of the terms being offered. The naval dimension of the Karesi resistance operations proved particularly significant for Ottoman military development, as the campaign required coordinating land and sea forces in ways that tested and expanded Ottoman maritime capabilities. The resisting Karesi fortresses relied heavily on supply by sea, as Byzantine and Italian vessels could navigate coastal waters, bringing provisions that would enable prolonged resistance despite Ottoman land blockades. Orhan's response demonstrated how far Ottoman naval development had progressed since the crude initial attempts during the Nicomedia siege. His fleet, now numbering perhaps 60 vessels and crewed increasingly by experienced sailors recruited from previously conquered territories, including Greek Christians with maritime expertise, could contest Karesi coastal waters with growing effectiveness. Ottoman naval forces, though still not matching Byzantine or Italian professional navies in seamanship or tactical sophistication, compensated due numbers, determination, and willingness to employ tactics like shore batteries and boarding actions that played to Turkish strengths in close combat, while minimizing the importance of advanced sailing skills. The gradual Ottoman naval success in constricting maritime supply lines to resisting Karesi fortresses demonstrated that the Ottomans were developing into a genuine naval power capable of operations beyond merely defending coastal territories. The human cost of the military operations against resisting Karesi strongholds, though far lower than casualties from the great sieges of Ottoman expansion's early phase, nonetheless involved significant suffering and destruction that the diplomatic annexation of most Karesi territories had successfully avoided. Several fortresses endured months of siege during which populations experienced food shortages, disease, and the constant anxiety of impending assault or surrender. Ottoman forces conducting the sieges also suffered casualties from disease, occasional sorties by desperate defenders, and the general hardships of maintaining blockades through winter weather. The territories surrounding resistant strongholds experienced economic disruption as agricultural production ceased, commerce halted, and populations fled to safer locations. Yet, compared to the catastrophic destruction and mass starvation that had characterized earlier Ottoman sieges like Bursa, the Karesi resistance operations were relatively limited in scope and duration, reflecting both Ottoman military efficiency and the resistors' recognition that their position was ultimately hopeless. By mid-1346, the last Karesi resistance strongholds had surrendered on terms similar to those offered earlier, completing Ottoman annexation of the entire Beylik through a combination of peaceful diplomatic annexation and limited military operations. The immediate aftermath of Karesi's complete annexation in 1346 witnessed Sultan Orhan moving swiftly to integrate the Beylik's most valuable asset, its maritime infrastructure, naval expertise, and experienced commanders into the Ottoman system, recognizing that these resources represented the campaign's true strategic prize beyond mere territorial expansion. Ottoman administrators conducted comprehensive surveys of Karesi ports, shipyards, and naval facilities, documenting existing capabilities and identifying opportunities for expansion and improvement. The Sultan personally visited the major ports of Pegae and Adramatium, meeting with Greek Christian shipwrights, Turkish Muslim naval commanders, and merchant communities to assure them that their specialized skills would be valued and rewarded under Ottoman governance. He commissioned immediate construction projects to expand shipyard facilities, ordered the building of additional vessels to Ottoman specifications, and most significantly, began recruiting the experienced Karesi naval commanders whose maritime expertise would prove invaluable for Ottoman operations in the Aegean and eventually the Dardanelles crossing into Europe. The incorporation of Karesi naval commanders into the Ottoman military hierarchy represented one of the campaign's most consequential outcomes, as these experienced maritime officers brought technical knowledge and tactical expertise that landlocked Anatolian Turkish warriors typically lacked. Several prominent Karesi naval leaders, recognizing that Ottoman service offered greater opportunities than resisting a power that had proven its overwhelming superiority, accepted positions commanding Ottoman naval forces with remarkable enthusiasm. They brought with them not just personal expertise, but also networks of sailors, knowledge of Aegean maritime conditions, established relationships with coastal communities throughout the region, and crucially, the confidence to operate in maritime environments that made most Turkish warriors profoundly uncomfortable. Orhan, demonstrating the same pragmatic willingness to employ talent regardless of origin that had characterized his governance of Greek Christian populations in conquered cities, gave these former Karesi commanders substantial authority and resources to build Ottoman naval capabilities. Recognizing that maritime power required specialized knowledge he could not generate through traditional Turkish military culture alone. The economic integration of Karesi territories into the Ottoman system proceeded with the same sophisticated attention to minimizing disruption and maximizing productivity that had characterized Ottoman governance in previously conquered regions. Ottoman administrators confirmed existing property arrangements for those who had submitted peacefully, established the Timar system to provide military feudal organization for newly conquered territories, and implemented commercial policies designed to attract merchants and stimulate the maritime trade that was the region's economic foundation. The ports that had thrived under Karesi rule, conducting Aegean commerce, were not just maintained but actively expanded, with Ottoman policies offering lower taxes and better security than had existed during the Beylik's final chaotic years. Greek Christian merchants who had feared that Muslim Turkish conquest might disrupt their commercial networks or impose religious persecution discovered that Ottoman governance actually improved their business environment through enhanced security, standardized regulations, and access to the larger Ottoman commercial system. According to economic records analyzed by historians such as Stefki Pamak, whose quantitative studies of Ottoman economic development provide detailed evidence, the Karesi ports under early Ottoman administration quickly achieved commercial volumes exceeding those from the independent Beylik period, demonstrating how effective governance could stimulate economic activity even in recently conquered territories. The strategic implications of Ottoman control over Karesi extended far beyond the Beylik's immediate territorial value to encompass the transformation of Ottoman geopolitical position in the eastern Mediterranean. Orhan now controlled both shores of the southern Marmara and northern Aegean, positioning Ottoman forces to potentially cross the Dardanelles into Europe whenever strategic circumstances became favorable. The naval capabilities acquired through Karesi annexation gave the Ottomans the ability to challenge Byzantine maritime dominance in regional waters, raid enemy coastal territories, and protect Ottoman merchant vessels engaged in Aegean commerce. Most significantly, controlling Karesi placed the Ottomans directly adjacent to Byzantine European territories across the narrow Dardanelles Strait, creating expansion opportunities that would transform a successful Anatolian regional power into a multi-continental empire within a generation. The geographic position that Karesi's occupation provided was perhaps more valuable than any other single consequence of the annexation, as it opened possibilities that would have remained foreclosed if the Ottomans had remained confined to interior Anatolian territories without direct access to strategic waterways. The reaction among other Anatolian beyliks to Ottoman annexation of Karesi combined resignation to what appeared to be inevitable Ottoman hegemony with anxiety about when similar pressure would be directed toward their own territories. The Aydin Beylik, which controlled important Aegean ports, including Smyrna, and had developed its own naval capabilities, recognized that Ottoman acquisition of Karesi positioned Orhan's forces on their northern border and that they might face a similar combination of diplomatic pressure and military threat in the future. Yet Aydin's ruler also calculated that maintaining friendly relations with the increasingly powerful Ottomans served his interests better than futile resistance, leading to diplomatic initiatives offering alliance and cooperation rather than defiance. Other beyliks further from immediate Ottoman borders nonetheless recognized the pattern of relentless Ottoman expansion and began their own calculations about whether accommodation or resistance would better serve their long-term survival. The psychological impact of Karesi's annexation led to the growing recognition throughout Anatolian Turkish principalities that Ottoman dominance was becoming inevitable, and that early accommodation might secure better terms than resistance, followed by eventual defeat, which would accelerate subsequent Ottoman expansion as beyliks chose voluntary submission over military confrontation. The Byzantine response to Ottoman annexation of Karesi revealed the empire's continuing strategic impotence and inability to prevent Turkish expansion even in territories immediately adjacent to Constantinople across easily navigable waterways. Emperor John V, now deeply embroiled in civil war against John VI, Kantakuzenos that would devastate Byzantine strength for years, could mount no effective opposition to Ottoman acquisition of territories that positioned Turkish forces within striking distance of Byzantine European possessions. Byzantine naval forces, though still superior to Ottoman fleets and professional seamanship, lacked the numbers or resources to challenge Ottoman coastal control, given the empire's other military commitments and chronic financial shortages. Most devastatingly for the Byzantine strategic position, The empire's internal political divisions meant that different Byzantine factions actually sought Ottoman alliance and assistance against their domestic rivals, a pattern that would soon allow Orhan's forces to cross into Europe, not as invaders but as invited allies of Byzantine civil war participants. The inability to present unified resistance to Ottoman expansion, itself a consequence of Byzantine political decay and factional conflicts, ensured that Karesi's annexation would be merely one more stage in the empire's inexorable territorial contraction. The months following Karesi's complete annexation witnessed fundamental reorganization of Ottoman military structure to incorporate the naval capabilities and maritime expertise that the campaign had secured, transforming the Ottomans from a purely land-based power into a state capable of projecting force across water and conducting combined land-sea operations. Sultan Orhan established formal naval administrative structures, appointing experienced Karesi commanders to senior positions with authority over shipbuilding programs, crew recruitment and training, and the development of Ottoman naval doctrine that could guide future maritime operations. The Sultan recognized with characteristic strategic wisdom that effective naval power required more than simply building ships. It demanded creating institutional structures, developing tactical doctrines, training specialized personnel, and establishing logistical systems capable of sustaining maritime operations over extended periods. The organizational work conducted during 1346 and 1347, though less dramatic than battles or conquests, laid the foundations for the Ottoman navy that would eventually dominate the eastern Mediterranean and challenge European naval powers for supremacy. The development of distinctively Ottoman naval tactics during this period reflected the synthesis of Turkish military traditions with maritime expertise acquired from Karesi commanders and Greek, Christian sailors, creating hybrid approaches that maximize Ottoman strengths while compensating for weaknesses relative to more established naval powers. Ottoman naval doctrine emphasized boarding and close combat rather than sophisticated sailing maneuvers, essentially transforming naval engagements into the kind of hand-to-hand fighting where Turkish warriors excelled. Ottoman vessels were designed or modified to carry large numbers of soldiers who could overwhelm enemy crews once ships closed a boarding range, effectively treating naval combat as land warfare conducted on floating platforms. This tactical approach, though crude compared to Byzantine or Venetian naval sophistication, proved surprisingly effective by playing to Ottoman advantages in close-quarters combat while minimizing the importance of advanced seamanship that took generations to develop. The doctrine's effectiveness would be demonstrated repeatedly in subsequent decades as Ottoman naval forces achieved victories against theoretically superior enemies by employing tactics that negated their opponents' traditional advantages. The recruitment and training programs Orhan established to crew the expanding Ottoman fleet revealed pragmatic willingness to employ diverse populations based on competence rather than ethnic or religious identity. Greek Christian sailors from Karesi and other conquered coastal territories were actively recruited with promises of good pay, religious freedom, and opportunities for advancement. Their maritime expertise valued despite their faith differing from the Muslim Turkish ruling elite. Turkish warriors from interior regions were encouraged to serve in naval forces through special incentives and appeals to Ghazi ideology, framing maritime operations as jihad against Christian enemies, gradually building a Turkish-Muslim naval tradition that had not previously existed. The training programs combined instruction in basic seamanship for Turkish landsmen with military drilling for Greek sailors and Ottoman combat tactics, creating crews capable of both navigating vessels and fighting effectively once of boarding range was achieved. This synthesis of different population strengths, though it would take years to fully mature, established patterns of Ottoman naval recruitment that would persist for centuries. The shipbuilding programs Orhan initiated after Karesi's annexation demonstrated both an ambitious vision and a practical recognition of the Ottoman state's financial and technical limitations. The Sultan commissioned construction of new vessels in the expanded Karesi shipyards, with initial targets of perhaps 20 new warships annually. Modest by Byzantine or Venetian standards, but representing substantial investment for a state that had possessed virtually no naval capabilities just 2 decades earlier. The ship designs combined Turkish preferences for vessels capable of carrying large numbers of soldiers with Greek technical expertise in hull construction, sail rigging, and other maritime engineering details. The financing for this naval expansion came from the expanding Ottoman treasury, fed by taxation of increasingly prosperous conquered territories, demonstrating how successful governance and economic development created resources, enabling further military expansion. Yet Orhan also recognized constraints, avoiding overambitious programs that might drain resources needed for other priorities, and focusing initial efforts on building solid foundations for later expansion rather than attempting to immediately matched established naval powers fleets. The strategic doctrine governing the deployment of Ottoman naval forces after Karesi's annexation emphasized supporting land operations and protecting Ottoman commercial interests, rather than seeking decisive fleet battles against superior enemies. Ottoman vessels conducted coastal raids against Byzantine islands and territories, operations that served both military purposes of weakening enemies and economic purposes of providing plunder that helped finance naval operations. Ottoman naval forces protected merchant vessels carrying commerce through Ottoman-controlled waters, creating security that stimulated economic activity while denying piracy revenues to enemies. Most significantly, Ottoman naval capabilities were systematically developed, with the future crossing of the Dardanelles into Europe as the ultimate strategic objective, with all shipbuilding programs, training efforts, and tactical development oriented toward enabling that eventual operation. This clear strategic focus prevented diffusion of resources across multiple objectives and ensured that Ottoman naval development proceeded purposefully toward defined goals, rather than merely replicating what other naval powers were doing, without a clear vision of how maritime capabilities would serve Ottoman strategic interests. The personal transformation of Ottoman military culture during the Karesi campaigns revealed how the conquest of maritime territories and the incorporation of naval expertise challenged traditional Turkish warrior identity and required evolution in how Ottomans understood their martial capabilities. Turkish warriors whose entire cultural heritage emphasized horsemanship and land combat initially viewed naval service with suspicion or outright disdain, considering maritime operations inferior to the cavalry warfare that had defined Turkish military excellence for centuries. Orhan and his commanders had to actively work to overcome these cultural prejudices, framing naval service as jihad, equally meritorious to land warfare, providing generous incentives for warriors willing to serve at sea, and publicly honoring successful naval commanders to demonstrate that maritime service could bring glory and advancement comparable to traditional cavalry roles. This cultural shift, though gradual and never complete during Orhan's lifetime, nonetheless began the transformation that would eventually produce distinctively Ottoman naval traditions and create the maritime power that future sultans would employ to dominate Mediterranean waters. The process demonstrated how successful empires adapt cultural traditions to meet new strategic requirements rather than remaining rigidly bound to ancestral practices that may no longer serve evolving circumstances. The acquisition of Karesi territories and naval capabilities positioned the Ottoman state to seriously contemplate what had previously been mere fantasy, crossing the Dardanelles straight into Byzantine Europe and establishing a permanent Ottoman presence on the European continent. Sultan Orhan, now 60 years old but still vigorous and strategically ambitious, recognized that Karesi's ports provided ideal launching points for expeditionary forces that could cross the narrow waters separating Asia from Europe, and that the naval capabilities acquired through annexation made such crossings logistically feasible rather than suicidal ventures. The strategic attractions of European expansion were overwhelming. Byzantine territories in Thrace offered rich agricultural lands, established cities, and control of approaches to Constantinople itself. The fractured political situation among Balkan Christian powers created opportunities for alliances and intervention similar to those that had served Ottoman expansion in Anatolia, and European operations would position the Ottomans as a major regional power rather than merely a successful Anatolian Beylik. Yet Orhan also recognized the risks of premature European expansion. Overextension could leave Ottoman forces vulnerable to coordinated Christian counterattacks. Logistics across water were inherently more complex and fragile than land operations, and European intervention might trigger the kind of crusading response that localized Anatolian expansion had not provoked. The Byzantine civil war that erupted in 1341 between Emperor John V Palaiologos and his father-in-law John VI Kantakozanos created precisely the kind of opportunity for Ottoman European intervention that Orhan had been waiting for. As both Byzantine factions desperately sought military allies who could provide the forces necessary for victory, regardless of long-term strategic implications, Kantakozanos, the more diplomatically skilled of the two rivals, recognized that the Ottomans now possessed military capabilities that could prove decisive in Byzantine factional conflicts, and initiated diplomatic contacts exploring whether Orhan might provide military assistance in exchange for various concessions. The specific terms discussed in these early negotiations remain somewhat obscure in the historical sources, but clearly involved Ottoman forces crossing into Europe to fight on Kantakozanos' behalf against Palaiologos, with compensation including territorial concessions, marriage alliances, and most significantly, Byzantine acquiescence to continued Ottoman expansion in both Anatolia and potentially Europe. These negotiations, though they would not bear full fruit until after the Karesi campaign's completion, demonstrated how Byzantine internal divisions created opportunities for Ottoman expansion that no amount of Turkish military capability alone could have generated. The Italian Maritime Republic's response to Ottoman acquisition of Karesi and the implied threat to their commercial dominance in Aegean waters revealed the gap between their considerable economic interests in the region and their limited willingness to commit military resources to containing Ottoman expansion. Venice and Genoa both maintained extensive commercial networks throughout the Byzantine Empire and conducted profitable trade with various Anatolian beyliks, including previously with Karesi itself. The prospect of a powerful, unified Ottoman state controlling both Anatolian and potentially European shores of strategic waterways threatened to disrupt these commercial arrangements or, at a minimum, create a single powerful interlocutor who could demand higher transit fees and more favorable terms than the fragmented beyliks had been able to extract. Yet despite these concerns, neither Venice nor Genoa proved willing to organize military expeditions to reverse Ottoman expansion. Calculating that maintaining profitable commercial relations with the Ottomans through negotiated agreements served their interests better than costly military interventions that might fail and would certainly disrupt trade. This commercial pragmatism over crusading ideology characterized Italian relations with the Ottomans for centuries and contributed significantly to Ottoman success by ensuring that the most capable Christian naval powers remained neutral or even friendly rather than organizing coordinated opposition. The broader European awareness of Ottoman expansion and the potential threat it represented to Christian Europe remained surprisingly limited in the mid-14th century. With most European powers focused on the Hundred Years' War, Italian conflicts, and various local disputes that seemed far more pressing than distant developments in Anatolia, Pope Clement VI issued statements about the need to support Byzantium against Muslim Turkish expansion and called for crusading expeditions to recover Christian territories. But these papal proclamations generated minimal concrete response, given Europe's preoccupation with other conflicts. The Kingdom of Hungary, which would eventually face direct Ottoman threat as Turkish forces expanded into the Balkans, was consumed by internal succession disputes and conflicts with neighboring powers. The various Balkan kingdoms and principalities that would bear the brunt of future Ottoman expansion, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Wallachia, were locked in their own regional conflicts and often proved more interested in exploiting Byzantine weakness for territorial gain than in supporting the empire against Turkish pressure. This European distraction and disunity, though it would not last indefinitely, provided a crucial window during which Ottoman expansion could proceed without facing the kind of coordinated Christian response that might have checked Turkish advance if European powers had recognized the long-term strategic threat earlier. The demographic and cultural implications of potential Ottoman expansion into Europe, though not immediately apparent in the 1340s, would prove among the most consequential aspects of the opportunities that Karesi's annexation created. If Ottoman forces could establish a permanent presence in European territories, it would mark the first time since the early Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries that Muslim armies had successfully conquered and held significant European lands. The prospect of Turkish Muslim governance over Christian European populations raised theological, cultural, and political questions that would preoccupy European thinkers for centuries. Whether Christian populations could legitimately live under Muslim rule, whether such arrangements represented temporary political circumstances or fundamental civilizational defeat, and how European identity would be affected by permanent Muslim presence on the continent. These questions, though they would only fully emerge after Ottoman European conquests became an established reality, nonetheless began to surface in the mid-1340s as perceptive observers recognized that Ottoman acquisition of territories bordering the Dardanelles made European expansion increasingly likely. The cultural and religious boundaries between Christian Europe and Muslim Asia, which had seemed relatively stable for centuries, were about to undergo fundamental reordering. The military and strategic planning Orhan conducted in the aftermath of Karesi's annexation revealed his recognition that European operations would require capabilities and resources beyond what had sufficed for Anatolian expansion. He ordered systematic intelligence gathering about Byzantine European territories, Balkan political situations, and potential Christian coalition responses to Ottoman expansion. He initiated planning for the logistics of transporting substantial forces across the Dardanelles and sustaining them in European territories potentially hostile to Muslim Turkish armies. He explored potential alliance structures with Byzantine factions, Balkan princes, or other Christian leaders who might welcome Ottoman military support against their own enemies in exchange for accepting Turkish presence in Europe. Most significantly, Orhan recognized that European expansion would require justification in Islamic religious terms that could mobilize Ghazi warriors while also managing international Muslim opinion about whether Ottoman conquests represented legitimate jihad or reckless adventurism. The careful preparation the Sultan conducted during the mid-1340s, though European operations would not commence in full scale until later in his reign, demonstrated the thoughtful strategic planning that had characterized Ottoman expansion throughout Orhan's rule and would continue to guide the empire's extraordinary growth for generations. The historical significance of the Karesi campaigns and annexation extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains to encompass a fundamental transformation of Ottoman strategic capabilities and geopolitical position that would enable the empire's subsequent expansion into Europe and evolution into a world historical power. The acquisition of maritime territories, naval infrastructure, and experienced commanders converted the Ottomans from a landlocked Anatolian Beylik into a state capable of projecting power across water, conducting combined land-sea operations, and competing with established Mediterranean naval powers. This transformation, though it would take decades to fully mature, began in earnest with Karesi's annexation and represented one of Sultan Orhan's most consequential strategic achievements, despite being less dramatic than battlefield victories or famous sieges. Modern historians examining the Ottoman rise consistently identify the Karesi campaigns as a critical turning point when the empire acquired capabilities essential for its subsequent expansion, demonstrating that territorial conquests matter not just for the lands acquired, but for the strategic possibilities they enable. The precedent established by Karesi's largely peaceful annexation through diplomatic pressure, supplemented by limited military operations, influenced Ottoman expansion methodology for generations, demonstrating that territorial acquisition could be achieved more efficiently through a combination of inducements and threats than through purely military conquest. Future Ottoman campaigns against other Anatolian beyliks would follow the Karesi template: extensive diplomatic preparation to exploit internal divisions, generous offers to elites willing to submit peacefully, overwhelming military deployments to intimidate potential resistors, and limited force employment only where diplomatic methods proved insufficient. This approach minimized Ottoman casualties and resource expenditure while maximizing territorial gains, proving far more efficient than the dramatic sieges and pitched battles that receive more attention in chronicles, but actually achieved less strategic value relative to their costs. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Heath Bowery and Seamal Kafadar, whose comparative studies of Ottoman expansion methods document both peaceful and military annexation approaches, the Karesi campaigns represented the maturation of Ottoman strategic thinking from simple military conquest toward sophisticated statecraft that employed all available tools to achieve territorial expansion. The integration of diverse populations, Turkish Muslims, Greek Christians, and various other communities into a unified Ottoman administrative and military structure reached new sophistication during the Karesi annexation and its aftermath, as the maritime expertise required for naval operations came almost entirely from non-Turkish populations, whose specialized knowledge had to be valued regardless of ethnic or religious difference from the ruling elite. The success of this integration, with Greek Christian sailors and former Karesi Muslim commanders serving effectively in Ottoman forces without the religious or ethnic tensions that might have been expected, validated the Ottoman model of pragmatic tolerance and merit-based advancement that would characterize the empire's governance for centuries. This demonstrated capacity to incorporate and utilize diverse talents regardless of origin gave the Ottomans enormous advantages over rivals whose more rigid ethnic or religious hierarchies prevented them from fully exploiting their subject population's capabilities. The pattern established during Karesi integration, identifying valuable skills and knowledge, recruiting or coercing experts regardless of background, providing sufficient incentives for loyal service, and creating administrative structures that could coordinate diverse groups toward common objectives, would be replicated throughout Ottoman expansion and proved essential for governing a multi-continental empire incorporating dozens of ethnicities and religious communities. The naval power that emerged from Karesi's annexation, though modest in its initial form, provided foundations for Ottoman maritime capabilities that would eventually dominate eastern Mediterranean waters and challenge European naval supremacy. The shipyards established or expanded in former Karesi ports continued producing vessels for decades, training successive generations of Ottoman shipwrights who refined techniques and improved designs. The naval commanders recruited from Karesi and other maritime territories established Ottoman naval traditions and tactical doctrines that future Ottoman admirals would build upon, Most significantly, the institutional structures created to administer Ottoman naval forces recruitment systems, training programs, logistics organizations, and strategic planning processes provided frameworks that could support unlimited expansion as resources became available. The Ottoman navy that would transport armies across the Dardanelles in the 1350s, besiege Constantinople by sea in 1453, and dominate the Mediterranean in the 16th century traced its institutional origins to the administrative and military structures established during and after the Karesi campaigns. The economic consequences of Karesi's annexation proved remarkably beneficial for both the Ottoman state and the region's commercial communities, demonstrating how effective governance could stimulate prosperity even in recently conquered territories. The enhanced security that Ottoman administration provided eliminated the piracy and factional conflicts that had plagued Karesi during its final years of independence, making maritime commerce safer and more profitable. The integration into the larger Ottoman commercial system provided Karesi merchants access to markets and trade networks throughout Ottoman territories, opportunities that had been unavailable when the Beylik was isolated and small. The Ottoman policy of lower taxation, combined with vigorous enforcement against corruption and monopolistic practices, created a business environment more favorable than what had existed under either Byzantine or independent Beylik governance. The result, documented in commercial records and tax registers analyzed by economic historians, was a rapid increase in trade volumes, port revenues, and general prosperity that made Karesi annexation economically beneficial even for populations who might have preferred political independence but recognized that Ottoman governance delivered tangible material advantages. The personal legacy of Sultan Orhan as viewed through the Karesi campaigns revealed a mature strategic thinker who had evolved from the young warrior who inherited a frontier principality into a sophisticated statesman capable of employing diplomacy, economic inducement, psychological pressure, and, when necessary, limited military force to achieve territorial expansion with remarkable efficiency. The Karesi annexation demonstrated all the strategic principles that had guided Orhan's reign: patience in preparing operations rather than rushing into premature action, flexibility in employing whatever methods, peaceful or military, would achieve objectives most efficiently, sophisticated understanding of how to exploit enemies' internal divisions and weaknesses, generosity toward defeated opponents that built Ottoman reputation while minimizing future resistance, and consistent focus on building institutions and capabilities that would outlast his personal rule and enable his successors to continue expansion. These qualities, more than any single battlefield victory or dramatic siege, explained how Orhan transformed a modest inheritance into an empire in waiting and established foundations that would support 6 centuries of Ottoman power. The final assessment of the Karesi campaigns must acknowledge both their immediate strategic success and their broader historical significance in enabling Ottoman transformation from Anatolian regional power into a multi-continental empire. The annexation itself, achieved through a masterful combination of diplomacy and limited military operations, provided the Ottomans with naval capabilities, strategic positioning, and maritime expertise that had been utterly lacking just 2 decades earlier. The precedents established peaceful annexation, rewarded resistance, punished but not excessively, and diverse populations integrated based on merit would guide Ottoman expansion for generations. The institutional and administrative structures created to govern conquered territories and utilize acquired naval resources provided templates that could be scaled to manage increasingly vast and diverse territories. Most significantly, Karesi's annexation positioned the Ottomans to cross into Europe, opening possibilities that would transform Ottoman history and reshape the Mediterranean role for centuries. In this sense, the Karesi campaigns of 1345 to 1346, though less famous than dramatic battles or legendary sieges, represented one of the most consequential episodes in Ottoman history. The moment when a successful Anatolian Beylik acquired the capabilities and strategic position necessary to become a world historical empire that would dominate 3 continents and endure until the 20th century.